So, right, executive pay. We're in the middle of Remco season. I see even today my emails are coming through. More chief execs facing all kinds of bashing from shareholders today. So it's all happening hot off the press, middle of the season. So introducing our panel discussing this pretty crucial topic, I've got on the furthest away from me is Stefan Stern, Director of the High Pay Centre. Some of you will recognise him as a journalist appearing in the lights of the Financial Times. Next to him is Philip Hutchinson, an independent reward practitioner, recently of Aker Solutions, a practitioner like many of you in the room. In the centre, Corinne Carr, who's also an independent reward practitioner, does a lot of consulting on share schemes. Over here, second from the end, Rob Horrocks, a group compensation and benefits director at Merlin Entertainments. And then closest to myself, Andrew Ninian, Director of Corporate Governance and Engagement at the Investment Association. So all have views on all sorts of things to do with exec pay and remuneration and LTIPs and options and so on. For this particular panel, what I thought would be a good way of doing it is to ask each panelist to talk for 2 minutes on an issue or topic related to executive pay that they feel particularly strongly about. So I'm going to start with Andrew, and you had 3 things you wanted to raise today. Yeah,
thank you. So Investment Association represents UK-based asset managers, so we represent some of the institutional investors who will be voting at the 27 AGMs that are going on today. And I thought it'd be useful just to cover the 3 things that are really top of investors' minds at the moment when they're looking at both being consulted on remuneration structures, but also when they're voting. So they are, what is the level of pay? What is pay for performance, and what are the structures of pay? And I'll just go into a bit more detail, very top-line detail for you. So in terms of level of pay, very clear that this year investors are taking a very strong line on increases to pay. They've been doing it for many years on base salaries, looking at base salaries only to be increasing in line with inflation or the wider workforce. This year, real focus on variable pay. And actually, they are being a lot stronger than I had expected them to. So we will see some results where I think companies have been proposing increases and they get quite a negative reaction from investors. And actually, some of the FTSE 20 are leading the way in actually reducing quantum this year. BP, Reckitt Benckiser and Glaxo are 3 that have reduced the quantum in their new policies. Pay for performance is not going to go away. Investors want to see that the pay that the chief executive actually receives during the year is commensurate with performance, and it's not just about the formulaic outcome. It's about taking the rounded view about what has been the shareholder experience, what has been performance in the round bin, does the committee need to use its discretion and reduce payouts to make it an appropriate link between pay and performance. And finally, structures. There's been a lot of debate in the last year around what is the right structure. The LTIP structure, much used, much loved, much hated. Companies feel they're forced into it. But actually, there has been a lot of debate about can we use a different structure, and restricted shares has got some publicity. It is not loved by all investors, but I think that debate about what is the right structure, particularly for long-term performance, is going to continue to rumble on. And I think the one thing that we would say is if you are thinking about doing something different, moving away from the LTIP, even if you are using an LTIP, you need to be clear about how the remuneration structure links into your long-term strategy. That is the key thing. Articulate the link between remuneration and long-term strategy.
Great, thank you. Stefan, I'm going to ask you now to talk about pay ratios. We talked about it earlier, but come in with the exact angle.
Thank you. I can thank Duncan for doing half my job for me, at least, with a very sensible and full answer on pay ratios. I would just add one extra bit of evidence that perhaps is worth considering is that CIPD research from December 2015, which did show, I think, quite plausible evidence of a real demotivational effect of big gaps, but it is perhaps the only bit of decent survey work that's been done into it so far, and we do need more. But my advice would be to prepare for them, given where we are in the political cycle and given the rhetoric that all the parties seem to be using now about executive pay and excessive pay at the top and pay gaps. You know, the Prime Minister says that the Conservatives are for ordinary working people, and she said last year that the gap was irrational and unhealthy. So I would get ready to do them. That would be my free bit of advice. It shouldn't be that difficult to do. Of course, some people will make some unfair or unhelpful comparisons, but they're going to be obviously unfair and unhelpful. I think it's the sector-based comparisons that are going to be interesting and useful. I think it'll add something. And if I could just add one more thing, it's really the systemic problem of high pay that I really like to focus on. Some of the assumptions that are made, some of the thinking or so-called thinking on which some of these reports and structures are based, I think is faulty. And everyone's got to raise their game a bit. I don't like to point to any one element in it. But that's the environment we're in now, and things are going to change, so I'd get ready to change.
Do you think we'll see legislation on it?
Well, the government will be reluctant to do anything too heavy-handed. However, I think pay raises is a very simple thing to call for and require, and you know, I think the investment associations come out in favour of them. Lots of perhaps slightly unexpected people are now in favour of them, and looks like we're going to have the same people in charge after June the 8th, and they've been pretty clear about doing something, and that's something.
Okay, interesting. Right, I want to get some practitioner views now. So, Rob, you want to raise 3 issues. You've got 2 minutes.
I do, thank you. My first reflection takes me back to the time when Merlin was private equity backed. Life was fairly simple. They wanted to maximise the value of the company. They didn't focus too much on the day-to-day, and the CEO was king. Rolling forward to flotation, we put in place a remuneration committee. We changed drastically our bonus plan and our share plans. And we had to accept a world full of rules, whether that be application of Morrison clawback, having a media spotlight on us, for instance. For anyone in the audience who's looking forward to going through a journey like that, I just want to warn you, the CEO might find it an uncomfortable journey. From being king to being seen as, potentially dictated to, take some adjustment. My second point is around that it's absolutely right and proper that the executive director's pay is disclosed and scrutinised. One thing I would say is that the executive committee, or whatever similar arrangements you've got, and the senior management team are absolutely key to drive the growth and success of the company going forward. So please don't neglect those guys, despite the big focus on the executive directors. My third point is around maintaining perspective in the PLC world. At flotation, Merlin put in place some pretty standard bonus and LTIP arrangements, reflecting key elements of a strategy with that crucial link. In 2015, many of you may remember that we had a tragic accident in Alton Towers. It caused major impact to the business and damage to our reputation and finances. Those simple reward arrangements I talked about, without the need to exercise any discretion at all, meant that the executive directors got no bonus in 2015. They also, 2 executive directors, asked not to be considered for a pay rise. In 2016, we underperformed and no bonus was payable again. And whilst the executive remuneration debate may give a different impression, some arrangements are doing the job they were designed to do. That being the case, when we get back to Merlin outperforming, which is our ambition, certainly looking forward to getting the full support of people in that. My only nervousness is the Remco have grown visibly more cautious because of this spotlight on them.
Philip, what's your 3 takeaways?
Well, in addition to what colleagues have said here, I think that from a delivery point of view, so I'm going to talk about how you get the horse to drink the water, that it's quite clear that the momentum and the desire for change is increasing. So rather than setting something up that just one step at a time, we need to rethink the way that we manage executive rewards so you can take constant change, if you like, in your stride. So in terms of the two main things I think that people should consider, the first is to understand who you need to consult with when you're looking at executive reward. So obviously you need to consult with the largest shareholders who are on the board, but you also need to consult with people like the Investment Association, the ISS, which is the Institutional Shareholders Service, because these people are becoming much more influential in terms of how shareholders vote. If you have a look at some of the shareholder revolts from last year, a lot of them were driven by the guide or the indices, if I can say, that the IA and ISS put forward. However, you've also then got to think about, well, what do the directors want? What do the board of directors want? So you're a little bit like the kingpin in the middle. So I think that the remuneration committees need to take a wider role. They need to have a much more proactive place in terms of managing stakeholders like employees, that's going to come their trade unions, what have you. I think this means that reward professionals need to engage with this much more. I think looking forwards, I see the executive reward management piece actually merging with the reward management piece. So for instance, if we're talking about having more pay, safer pay and pay ratios and everything, you won't be able to have the two split. And I think the executive reward piece has got to kind of widen its view. It's got to be a little bit more joined up. So for me, it's about being able to communicate right across the board and being able to administer whatever you develop. I think it was Deborah who was talking about important stuff and dialing back. I think sometimes when you look at executive reward, we go too far along being innovative, and then what happens is we fail to communicate it and then to deliver it.
Great. And Corinne?
Right, so now you have to tune into the French accent, I'm afraid, so just for the next 5 minutes. Right, so my 3 points are as follows. So just to pick up on what was just said, in terms of engagement, I think it's really important to actually find out who that person is at the other end, because sometimes when we send out our proposals, we just send them to the top shareholders, not knowing who that person is. If you can make that personal connection, make no mistakes. When the questions come back on the DRR, they will be directed back to you. So if you've got that connection in the first place, it's really helpful to clear out any misunderstanding or provide any information so that you quickly get to resolutions. It's got me a few points in the past when engaging with shareholders, so please bear that in mind. The other point I'd like to make is that when we are making decisions on executive pay, as reward practitioners, we are the subjects of conflicting, confusing, and sometimes uncompromising advice from various different sources. Whereas there's, whether they are internal sources, because it's not just about HR, you've got finance involved, risk involved, legal, COSEC, investor relations, you name it. It's not an HR game anymore. On the other hand, from an external point of view, we've got, the investors, we've got the think tanks, we've got government pressures as well to think about. So let's just remember that the only decision makers are the remuneration committee members. Everybody else is providing advice. And I think if we can step back and just remember that when we are gathering the information, our role as reward professionals is to distill all that information and provide options to our REMCOs. So let's get that information, but simplified so that they remember they are the decision makers. The last point I'd like to make is looking at future trends. There is an increased focus on the part of investors in responsible investment. Responsible investment is when factors such as environmental, social, and governance factors are taken into consideration in investment strategies. We also know that there is an increased focus on the part of the regulators, certainly in financial services, but across the industries in general, on conduct and culture. By including ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors, in the design of incentive plans. We both amend and modify behaviours and create a clear link between compensation, conduct and culture. And in fact, I believe we've got at least one firm in the audience who is Shell, I don't know who you are, there you go, who are already doing that by combining the greenhouse gas emissions with the bonus plan. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that later. So I've got 3 actions for you to take back to the office tomorrow when you get back to work. The first one is get informed. Please learn about and read about responsible investment. This is not a subject that's going away. The number of signatories of the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment that I closely work with, the number of signatories has gone from 100 signatories 10 years ago to 1,700 now. It's on the up, it's not going away. Investors have got a keen eye on that because it's helpful to mitigate risks and create long-term sustainable returns. The second action I've got for you when you go back to work tomorrow is reach out to your sustainability committee, your sustainability team, find out what they're working on and how these factors affect the business strategy. And then lastly, when you have your next remuneration committee meeting, you might want to think about how you can incorporate those factors, environmental, social and governance factors, into the design of incentive plans. So to echo what my colleagues have said, there is absolutely no, we are not changing. Pay has got to be linked to performance. However, I also believe there is a strong business case to motivate and incentivize our leaders to perform for society as a whole.
Interestingly, before you started speaking, a question already came through linked to what you were saying. So I'm going to read out that question because perhaps other people on the panel would like to contribute. So the question reads, should senior executives be paid purely on business performance, or should a shift be made towards social investment, pay based on the value they add to a society? Do any of the other panel have a view on that? Andrew's looking like he's trying not to say anything.
I think as investors, we want companies that deliver long-term returns. Companies are not going to deliver long-term returns unless they are managing their stakeholders, they are good in society. So in a sense, we feel that is wrapped into being a good long-term company. It's about having a strategy which is going to deliver value over the long term, and in doing that, you need to make sure you deliver in society as well. So I think I agree with Corinne's point, but I think those metrics need to be clearly aligned to the implementation of the strategy and very, very quantifiable. I think where you will get into trouble if they are broad, touchy-feely type measures and shareholders are not accepting of broad well-being type measures. They need to be quite quantifiable and clearly linked back to the strategy. So I think just keep it strategic, and it does feed into that impact on society.
I'm going to move on from that question because there's quite a few questions coming through. Maybe the rest of the panel will be relieved. The next one I want to, it keeps moving, to Stefan in the first instance, but get the views perhaps from Philip and Rob and and Corinne as well. Do investors have too much control over pay? Quite a few people like that question.
No. We need more activism, more engagement, more votes. But as I say, I think it's a systemic problem. I don't think the Remcos are functioning well. I don't think, Corinne is excellent, but I don't think all the pay consultants are necessarily doing the best job they could be doing. I think some executives are just asking for too much, and that's why pay keeps going up. Some people are asking for too much, and they're getting it. It's as simple as that. But that means there's a systemic problem. So now we want engaged, active, thoughtful, purposeful investors with lots of power. They do own the shares. They're entitled to be active.
Philip?
I would agree with that. And it makes the reward job a bit easier because we know who essentially we're kind of working for. But I think the trick is because you've got so many different stakeholders with diverse expectations. So one of the phrases I use quite a lot in executive remuneration is the turkeys voting for Christmas. So how do you balance the needs of the board of directors who think maybe they should get a bit more with actually demonstrating that they are worth more? And it's going back again to, as reward practitioners, to sit in the middle of all of this, to manage all the expectations of the stakeholders, to ask the investors, what's important to you, directors, employees, and then use that data, if you like, or insight to start to come up with, I'm going to use the word compromise, where all the parties are getting at least 80% of what they're looking for, rather than nothing at all.
Okay.
Yeah, from my point of view, I don't think investors have got too much influence. As I say, they are ultimately the owners of the business. Yeah. One of the conversations I've had with our CEO is the fact that he sees these multiples and he's very uncomfortable with what they're doing. His only observation is that the adherence to the norm of benchmarking just makes that self-sustaining, and that's actively unhelpful.
Mm-hmm. We've got a couple of questions asking about LTIPs. So the one said, do you feel... Sorry, they keep moving. How do we break the cycle of no one liking LTIPs but alternatives not being accepted or disliked by investors? Or somebody else asking a similar question, do we see the traditional structure of base pay, bonus and LTIP being swept away? But again, if that went away, what would be there?
Can I just start with a bit of a defence of the LTIP stuff? We put our plans in place 3 years ago. Merlin is a company which has aggressive growth plans, and we invest a lot of money in building new attractions. On that basis, that's exactly our strategy, and that's tied to the LTIP, which looks at our increase in our earnings per share and our return on capital employed, directly linked, supported by our shareholders. And on that basis, it works very well for us. There's no reason to bin it in our case.
Mm-hmm.
So we did a lot of work on this last year. We established an independent working group called the Executive Remuneration Working Group. There, we set them the task of seeing whether there was a simpler structure of executive remuneration which could get market traction. And they came up quite clearly with the view that there needs to be more flexibility in structures, that the LTIP works for some companies, but actually in recent years we've added a lot of complexity, be it holding periods, malus, clawback, which has done two things. One, it's created a massive discount in some executives' mind, particularly if they feel that the targets which are set over the next 3 years either aren't attainable or it's difficult to set such targets. But also, because of that discount, the quantum or the level of the awards has gone up. So it's led to feast or famine. So you either get paid out massively or you get nothing. And I think where the working group got to was companies should choose the structure which is right for the business, which is linked to the strategy. And that was their main recommendation. They then had 9 other recommendations about actually how could that be implemented. Because it could only be implemented to move away from LTIPs if there was trust between investors and the Remcos. And they felt that trust had been lost and that there needed to be work to rebuild that trust. So they set out recommendations covering engagement, disclosure, and strengthening the role of the Remuneration Committee. So I hope that we move away or have more diversity away from LTIPs. But it's going to be a challenge and it's going to be hard work.
Corinne, do you have a view?
Companies are not likely to move from LTIP to restricted shares until, you know, for as long as the LTIP vests quite nicely. I think you find that, you know, when it starts going down, then they might look at options. But for as long as they, you know, the returns are good, we're not moving away from LTIPs. I mean, that's the experience that I've come across.
And sorry, that creates a problem for the implementation, that investors are sceptical that the only companies that want to move away from LTIP is because the LTIP isn't paying out. And you get to a more, so for investor perspective, why should you accept a more guaranteed set of pay at a higher level, more certain than they would have got under the old system? So there is an inherent tension in the system.
Stefan?
The other thing that everyone seems to agree about is that we need more simplicity. These pay packages are too complicated. PhD accountancy students can't understand them. So people are voting on things they don't understand. And then they throw up very big numbers, and there's outrage and media protest and so on. And what we really want are REMCOs that are more confident and more assertive and use their discretion. The problem with the LTIPs is they do seem to be generating these enormous lumps of money, which no one seemed, the recipient, the board, the investors didn't seem to know was coming. And they seem to also be based on share price movements, which are often completely beyond the control of an individual chief executive, certainly even of the board. You know, there are geopolitical, commodity life cycle, role of competition, currency movements, all sorts of things that move the share price a lot. Nothing to do with what the decisions taken by executives. But they benefit from them. And so it's not really performance-related pay at all. It's luck-related pay. And this is what causes so much anger and concern.
I want to stop us there, because I think it's a nice, controversial moment. And the good news is that, to say sorry for the alarms this morning, we're getting free Prosecco outside. So I think if we can take this topic and keep discussing it over a few glasses of bubbly outside and really try and solve the whole exec rem problem. That would be brilliant. But before we do that, let's say thank you to our panel, and then I've got some housekeeping.